The jungle holds its breath. Once, these plazas rang with procession, music, and the clack of stone on stone. Now, only the wind reads the dates carved into temple walls. The greatest cities of the Maya world reached their peak between roughly 250 and 900 CE, then, in places, fell eerily silent. Imagine cities the size of modern towns: Tikal, Calakmul, Copan, Palenque, each ruled by lineages who read the heavens, kept detailed calendars, and carved their histories into stone. At their height, Maya kings claimed divine sanction, and the landscape was reshaped to feed millions. But by the 8th and 9th centuries, something changed. Inscriptions stop, monuments go uncarved, entire neighborhoods are abandoned. Archaeologists call this long, uneven process the terminal classic collapse. Not a single day of doom, but a century of unraveling across the southern lowlands. Today, scientists trace part of that unraveling to climate. High-resolution paleoclimate records, from lake sediments to stalagmites, reveal severe multi-year droughts during the same centuries when cities were failing. Crop failures, stressed water systems, and the political strain of feeding large urban populations likely compounded one another. Yet disappearance is a myth. While many southern lowland centers were abandoned, Maya peoples persisted, adapted, and moved. New northern centers rose, Chichen Itza and later Mayapan, and millions of Maya descendants still speak the languages, practice the rituals, and tend the fields their ancestors did. The story is not extinction, it is transformation. If you're ready to peel back the layers, to see how climate, politics, faith, and everyday choices braided together to alter a civilization, stay with us. Subscribe, hit the bell, and leave a comment. Which Maya site do you want us to explore next?
Long before temples rose above the canopy, people were already transforming this landscape into something new. Gardens, fields, and villages where the rhythms of sowing and harvest set the pace of life. Archaeological sites in Belize and Guatemala show continuous human occupation in the Maya area from the late Archaic into the pre-classic period. By about 2000 to 1000 BCE, communities had shifted from mobile foraging to settled agriculture and pottery making. The single pivot that made sedentism viable across Mesoamerica was maize, not merely a crop, but the foundation of food systems, ritual life, and social organization. Maize had been domesticated in Mesoamerica long before complex Maya society arose, and over centuries it was adapted and intensively cultivated in a range of local systems, from swidden plots to sophisticated raised field and terracing methods that supported larger populations. Pollen records and lake sediments confirm the increasing prominence of maize in the landscape as village life intensified. As staple production became more reliable, population densities rose and settlements grew into nucleated villages. These villages were not simply larger hamlets, they were organizing centers. By the Middle Pre-Classic, roughly 1000 to 400 BCE, some of these centers began building monumental architecture, plazas, earthen mounds, and causeways, gestures of collective labor that announced new social hierarchies and shared commitments. Nakbe, in the Petén lowlands, is one of the earliest well-documented examples where large constructions date back to the first millennium BCE. The late Pre-Classic, about 400 BCE to 250 CE, witnessed an extraordinary urban flowering. Sites such as El Mirador expanded into sprawling civic cores with colossal pyramid mounds, long causeways, and densely packed residential zones. At its height, El Mirador's La Danta Pyramid ranks among the largest constructions in the ancient Americas, proof that large labor forces and centralized planning were now possible in the lowland rainforest. These cities required not only food surpluses, but also administrative capacity, calendrical knowledge, ritual systems, and political leadership that could coordinate long-term projects. That administrative capacity left traces in stone. The raising of stelae and the carving of early inscriptions began in the pre-classic. By around 400 BCE, elite lineages were erecting monuments that recorded dates, events, and claims to sacred authority. These weren't decorative afterthoughts. They encoded time, ritual calendars, and dynastic memory, helping leaders legitimize power through visible histories set into public space. Urban form and cosmology were intertwined. Architects aligned plazas, pyramids, and causeways to celestial events and annual cycles, embedding astronomical observation into the city itself. Scholars studying El Mirador and other pre-classic centers have pointed out alignments that suggest early, deliberate use of solar and calendrical markers to order public ritual life and agricultural planning. In plain terms, the city was a giant calendar anyone could read. Economy and exchange knit the region together. Even in the pre-classic, goods and raw materials moved long distances. Obsidian and salt traveled between highland and lowland zones. Luxury items such as jade, shell, and cacao served as prestige markers and trade commodities. Control of these networks underpinned elite power, enabling certain families or centers to accumulate wealth and sponsor monumental projects. The emergence of specialized crafts, ceramics, stone carving, textile production, reinforced social differentiation as artisans worked for daily needs and elite display.
But the Maya were not a single uniform entity. The region was a mosaic of ecological niches, coastal lagoons, riverine lowlands, karst plains, and highland valleys, and each area produced its own adaptations. In the Mirador Basin, seasonal swamps, known as bajos, were turned into productive plots by moving and enriching swamp sediments, demonstrating local ingenuity in overcoming poor tropical soils. Elsewhere, farmers used terraces, raised fields, and managed forest gardens. This environmental diversity produced cultural diversity, different political forms, ritual expressions, and economic strategies grew from local conditions. Institutional complexity followed social complexity. By the late pre-classic, courts of nobles, ritual specialists, and emergent kings or divine lords regulated public life. These leaders combined ritual authority and administrative control. They performed ceremonies tied to the agricultural cycle, commissioned monuments that recorded lineage and time, and marshaled labor for urban construction. The ritual calendar was practical as well as symbolic. Ceremonies scheduled planting and harvest, propitiations timed to droughts or floods, and public festivals consolidated loyalty across kin groups and neighborhoods. Evidence from household archaeology, hearths, storage pits, and domestic architecture shows that most people did not live in palace compounds, but in ordinary homes aligned to kin-based farms. Food production, craft work, and local ritual sustained daily life, while public ritual and elite display created supra-household orders. This tension between household economy and collective monumental projects is central to understanding how early Maya polities negotiated resources and labor. Literacy and counting systems developed alongside these social transformations. The Maya script evolved from pictorial signs to a full logosyllabic system, and the vigesimal, base 20 calendar allowed them to compute long cycles of time.
These intellectual tools mattered. They enabled complex administration, astronomical prediction, and the recording of dynastic histories that would shape political claims for centuries. Early inscriptions and calendrical notations from the pre-classic show the emergence of the cognitive infrastructure that later defined classic Maya civilization. Ecology, then, was a stage and a constraint. The tropical forests provided timber, wild foods, and seasonally productive bajos, but rainforests are not inherently fertile for the intensive grain agriculture that supports dense cities. The Maya adapted with technical and social innovation, soil amendments, raised fields, and managed forest gardens. But these solutions required continuous labor and knowledge exchange across generations. Where innovation and political cohesion aligned, large urban centers flourished. Where they did not, growth faltered. Religion and cosmology infused material life. Maize itself entered myth as an origin story, humans made from corn, a narrative that linked food, fertility, and social order. Rituals around planting and harvest were inseparable from political legitimacy. Rulers staged performances that reenacted cosmic cycles, connecting the fate of the polity to the rhythm of the land. This fusion of practical agriculture with sacred story made political institutions appear as natural extensions of cosmic law. By the end of the pre-classic, the Maya world had become a landscape of cities and hinterlands, of ritual plazas and household gardens, of long-distance exchange and localized adaptation. Population growth, agricultural intensification, and institutional innovation had created the conditions for the classic era's spectacular achievements: writing, monumental architecture, and dynastic courts. But those very achievements also set new vulnerabilities. Larger populations demanded more consistent food supplies. Grand projects required sustained labor and administrative oversight, and political claims to sacred authority raised the stakes of competition. These seeds of complexity would shape the next chapters of Maya history. The birth of the Maya world is therefore not a single moment, but a slow weaving of seeds and soils, of stones and signs, of households and palaces. It is a story of people learning to stretch the possibilities of their environment, inventing calendars and scripts, and organizing shared labor to build something that would endure in stone and memory. When we walk among the low mounds of an early site, or stand beneath the shadow of a pre-classic pyramid, we see the outlines of a civilization in the act of becoming, experimental, adaptive, and profoundly human.
The Classic period, roughly 250 to 900 CE, is the era when the Maya turned cities into courts and courts into instruments of cosmic order. Across the southern lowlands, population density rose, monumental architecture multiplied, and inscriptions became the public record of kings, wars, and rights. Centers such as Tikal, Calakmul, Copan, and Palenque led a network of city-states whose rulers claimed sacred status and whose stone monuments announced that claim to anyone who entered the plaza. At the heart of classic Maya politics was the figure of the divine ruler, the Kuhulajau, the Holy Lord. Not merely an administrator, the king was a ritual mediator between people and cosmos. He performed bloodletting, presided over calendrical ceremonies, and staged public rituals that tied the health of the polity to celestial cycles. These acts were political technology. They legitimized dynasties, organized labor for construction, and created a shared sacred language that held communities together. That sacred language appeared in stone. Stelae, altars, and lintels carried long count dates
and narrative glyphs recording births, accessions, wars, and bloodletting events. These inscriptions turned time into a public script. They anchored royal claims in a chain of dated actions. Archaeologists and epigraphers working since the mid-20th century have shown that many inscriptions record specific historical sequences, rivalries, diplomatic marriages, and military victories, transforming the Maya from a mysterious lost people into political actors with biographies and agendas. Kingship also operated through spectacle. Cities organized events that gathered people from surrounding farmsteads, dedication ceremonies for new plazas, feasting events linked to the agricultural cycle, and public displays of captives or smelted trophies. The plazas were stages. Pyramids were both altars and broadcasting towers. Monumental architecture was labor-intense, and the ability to mobilize that labor signaled a ruler's reach. But it also created dependency. State legitimacy required continuous performance, and failure to supply ritual or food could be politically fatal. The classic polity was not a single empire, but a shifting web of city-states. Alliances and rivalries mattered. Tikal and Calakmul famously alternated periods of dominance, each supporting subsidiary sites, forging marriage ties, and sponsoring client rulers. Epigraphic evidence shows dynastic marriages, installation of vassal rulers, and even foreign interventions that rewrote local histories. The dynamics of polity and patronage replicated themselves across the lowlands, creating a political ecology of competition and cooperation. Interaction with non-Maya powers also influenced classic politics. The presence and possible intervention of the central Mexican metropolis Teotihuacan in the 4th and 5th centuries left archaeological traces, a new architectural vocabulary, foreign-style ceramics, and glyphic references, suggesting that long-distance alliances or military actions could reshape local dynasties. Such interactions remind us that Maya polities participated in broader Mesoamerican exchange and diplomacy, not isolation. Warfare became an increasingly visible instrument of policy. Far from ceremonial skirmishes alone, violence in the classic period could be systematic and brutal. Fortifications, burned structures, sculpted trophies, and inscriptions reporting captures or deaths point to sustained conflict. Recent paleoarchaeological studies and excavation reports document episodes where entire centers were sacked and deliberately burned, while stelae sometimes celebrate the capture or humiliation of rival rulers. War reshaped political maps and, at times, precipitated local breakdowns of order. Yet warfare coexisted with refined knowledge systems. The same courts that sponsored conquest also funded calendars, astronomy observation, and scribal schools. Maya astronomer priests tracked Venus, eclipses, and solar cycles with surprising precision. They correlated celestial events to ritual calendars and used that knowledge to time ceremonies and agricultural activities. The long count, Tzolkin, and Ha'ab 260-day and 365-day calendars were tools for both theology and governance, allowing rulers to ritualize time and justify actions within cosmic frameworks. This is visible in architecture. Temple pyramids and observatory-like structures were oriented to solar and lunar cycles. Palace panels and codices encoded predictions and ritual tables. The integration of astronomy into statecraft gave rulers an edge, the ability to read omen and season, and produced a civic literacy that extended from elite scribes to broader ritual participants. Astronomy was practical, political, and profoundly symbolic. Economy and tribute underpinned elite power. Cities controlled hinterlands that produced maize, cotton, and other staples. They also regulated long-distance trade in prestige goods, jade, cacao, marine shell, and obsidian, items that signaled status and funded elite consumption.
Control of trade routes, salt sources, and highland obsidian deposits was both economic lifeblood and political leverage. Tribute and sponsorship of artisans reinforced social hierarchies and made courts into centers of material and ideological concentration. Social complexity within the palace was mirrored in the city. Noble lineages, scribes, priestly specialists, military elites, and craft specialists formed a stratified society. Burial practices and tomb contents revealed differentiated wealth. Monumental tombs like those in Palenque or Copan contain rich goods, while ordinary households show modest material patterns. Elite consumption and ritual display were public signs of difference, but daily life for most people remained grounded in household farms, communal labor, and ritual tied to crop cycles. The power of script altered memory and legitimacy. Where rulers could commission stelae with long count dates, they could create a visible lineage that linked past and present. The recording of dates, births, accessions, victories, allowed dynasties to fabricate continuity, even in times of interruption. This public historiography became a battlefield of truth. Controlling the calendar and the script meant controlling the story of who held rightful power. Religion and politics were fused in ritual economy. Bloodletting, rulers piercing tongues or genitals to offer blood to ancestors, appears again and again on monuments. Such acts were not merely private piety, they were statecraft, performed to renew cosmic order and demonstrate that the ruler could sacrifice for the community. Blood, in Maya cosmology, linked the human to the supernatural, and rulers who failed to execute these obligations risked losing the sacral basis of their authority. Courts also competed through cultural production. Monument carving, mural painting, and courtly poetry became arenas in which prestige and ideas circulated. Mural cycles at Bonampak depict vivid court life, warriors, musicians, captives, while carved panels at Palenque record intricate dynastic narratives. Art was propaganda, pedagogy, and ritual, a medium for shaping memory and inspiring loyalty. The scale and sophistication of classic courts required an administrative backbone, scribes, record keepers, ritual specialists, and a legal ritual apparatus. This infrastructure allowed for taxation, distribution of labor, calendrical planning, and diplomatic correspondence. Yet it was expensive to run. The very investments that made cities magnificent, monuments, courts, and a scribal class, also created high maintenance costs with narrow margins for error when food or political cohesion faltered. The age of kings and gods, then, is a story of creative achievement and tightrope governance. On one hand, Maya courts produced art, science, and social systems of remarkable subtlety. On the other, they concentrated risk, competition, costly ritual economies, and dependence on stable food systems made polities vulnerable to drought, rebellion, and rupture. The same mechanisms that allowed rulers to project power could, in times of strain, produce cascading failures. As we watch a ruler carve his name into a stela, we should remember that the act is both monument and message, an assertion that the cosmos, the calendar, and the people bend to this lineage. Yet beneath the ceremony were everyday choices: how to allocate labor, when to declare war, how to manage water and field systems. The balance between spectacle and subsistence, between divine claim and practical provisioning, would determine whether a court endured or fractured.
The classic Maya world was not a single polity, but a dense web of city-states, nodes of power tied together by marriage, trade, diplomacy, and, when those ties failed, by war. Understanding the collapse that later followed means first seeing how deeply interwoven and fiercely competitive that web had become. At the center of many later conflicts lay two great rivals, Tikal in the central Petén and Calakmul in the western lowlands. Their contest was not constant open warfare, but a long-running strategic rivalry that played out through client states, dynastic marriages, courtly propaganda, and occasional pitched battles. Over centuries, each hegemon sought to shape the loyalties of smaller polities, installing friendly rulers or backing rivals to undermine adversaries. One of the clearest examples of political manipulation was the founding of Dos Pilas in 629 CE. Originally an offshoot of the Tikal dynasty meant to control Passion River trade routes, Dos Pilas soon became a focal point in larger games of influence. In the mid-7th century, Dos Pilas broke with Tikal and aligned with Calakmul, a shift that reversed local balances of power and set the stage for bloody confrontations. Calakmul's rise was tied to the so-called Ka'an, or Snake Dynasty. For much of the late Classic, the Snake Kingdom wielded influence across a vast swath of the lowlands, its emblem glyph appearing at sites hundreds of kilometers from the city itself. Calakmul's strategy was not simply conquest, it was network domination, building a coalition of vassal states whose rulers paid tribute, fought for Calakmul when called, and adopted the snake emblem to signal allegiance. Tikal responded with its own diplomatic and martial toolkit. At times, Tikal reasserted direct control. At others, it forged new alliances and installed client rulers. The episodic nature of power meant that victories could be decisive, but also temporary. Epigraphic records show repeated cycles, accession inscriptions, vassal installations, intercity marriages, followed by captures, defeats, and restorations. Power in the classic world was performative as much as territorial. These shifting loyalties had human consequences. When a city changed patrons, the local elite might be replaced, exiled, or killed. Captives were displayed and sacrificed. Monuments were defaced or recarved to erase previous claims. The archaeological record contains burned layers and hurriedly abandoned buildings that match episodes recorded in stone, evidence that political contests could become violent and destructive. Long-distance intervention shaped local dynasties as well. One emblematic moment came centuries earlier with the arrival of a foreign warlord named Siaj Kak in January 378 CE, an agent often linked to Teotihuacan influence. His entry into the Petén and the subsequent installation of new rulers at Tikal and Uaxactún illustrate that external powers could reconfigure Maya politics, introducing new elites and sparking realignments that echoed for generations. Warfare in the Classic period had many faces. Some conflicts were quick raids aimed at capturing captives for ritual display. Others were prolonged campaigns seeking to depose rulers and reorient entire regional networks. The scale could be staggering. Inscriptions speak of the capture of kings, mass presentations of captives, and the deliberate destruction of rival monuments. Acts designed not only to win territory, but to humiliate and erase opposing claims to legitimacy. The role of client states made the system brittle. A hegemon was only as secure as the loyalty of its satellites. If a vassal switched sides, the ripple effects could be immediate. Trade routes closed, tribute streams ceased, and military fronts opened. The case of Dos Pilas demonstrates how a single defection, or forced coup, could spark years of warfare across multiple polities, dragging previously neutral centers into conflict. Political maneuvering extended into ritual and ideology. Emblem glyphs, identifying signs of rulership tied to cities, were a language of authority. When a ruler claimed an emblem, he signaled a territorial and symbolic claim. When inscriptions were recarved or a stela torn down, those acts aimed to rewrite local history, a form of political censorship. Memory itself became contested territory. Trade and resource control were constant undercurrents in rivalries.
Salt, obsidian, jade, cacao, and coastal marine goods passed through networks that sustained urban elites. Control of these routes was both economic and strategic. A checkpoint on a river could be a choke point for rival supplies, and securing highland obsidian sources or coastal saltworks could finance armies and artisan workshops alike. Competition for such nodes fed political contests as surely as dynastic disputes did. Diplomacy sometimes displaced warfare. Marriage alliances could create durable bonds. A royal daughter marrying a foreign king might secure a generation of peace. Yet those alliances were fragile. If a ruling house weakened through drought, famine, or succession disputes, allies could see opportunity rather than protection and move to exploit the gap. The network diplomacy of the classic period was clever, but it was not foolproof. The chronology of key confrontations matters. In the mid-5th century, Tikal experienced a major reversal associated with Teotihuacan-linked interventions. Later, in the 6th century, Yucnum the Great of Calakmul expanded snake influence, using client states like Dos Pilas to press Tikal's borders. By the late 7th century, combined forces defeated Tikal in battles that left both cities and their sponsors reeling, a reminder that fortunes could turn rapidly when coalitions mobilized.
The social cost of rivalry was not limited to elites. Peasants and townspeople bore the brunt of conscription for labor and warfare, experienced disrupted harvests, and could be displaced by campaign-driven depopulation. Fortifications and defensive architecture appear at many sites during periods of increased conflict, signaling popular investment in protection as intra-city violence rose. Archaeology reveals hastily buried offerings and emergency repairs, the material traces of societies under pressure. The web of power also produced cultural cross-pollination. Client rulers often adopted the iconography, architectural styles, and ritual paraphernalia of their patrons. This explains why Calakmul-affiliated sites sometimes display similar motifs, or why Teotihuacan-style talud tablero architecture appears in the lowlands after 378 CE. Political influence carried with it aesthetic and ritual influence, a soft power that helped legitimize foreign-backed rulers. Inscriptions record dramatic reversals. Kings who once celebrated victories later erected stones commemorating defeats, or negotiated peace through symbolic acts. The rise and fall dynamics of the classic political landscape were often local accelerants of broader instability. A palace coup in one town could trigger refugee flows, resource shortages, and opportunistic raids in neighboring regions. The interconnectedness of polities meant that local crises could cascade. Historians reading glyphic texts have reconstructed sequences of vassalage, rebellions, and assassinations, a political theater as intricate as any court drama. The skill of Maya epigraphers in the late 20th and early 21st centuries transformed our understanding. Inscriptions are not mythic blurbs, but precise records revealing names, dates, and political acts. These texts make the classic world legible as a contested, strategic system, not a timeless ritual order. Yet the web's density had a downside. It amplified shocks. Environmental stress, crop failure, or succession crises could propagate through the network, weakening patron-client bonds and exposing nodes to predation. In some instances, prolonged droughts coincided with intensified warfare, a dangerous combination. When food and legitimacy both fray, allegiance flips, and the political fabric can tear. The Petex Batoon region offers a stark case study. Here, continual warfare in the late Classic produced successive layers of destruction, abandonment, and human suffering. Cities like Aguateca and Dos Pilas experienced sieges, elite flight, and eventual collapse, their remains preserving burned palaces and disarticulated household refuse, the archaeological signature of political meltdown at the local level. Importantly, rivalry did not always mean annihilation. Sometimes it produced resilience.
City-states adapted by shifting economic bases, reorganizing labor, or realigning diplomatically. Other polities survived by becoming more mobile, leaning more on hinterland production, or fostering more inclusive local governance. The web was dynamic, capable of both catastrophic unraveling and creative reconfiguration. The essence of the web of power and rivalry is this: classic Maya politics combined high cultural achievement with relentless strategic competition. Rulers wrote their names into stone, built monuments to the sky, and marshaled clients across hundreds of kilometers. But those very investments, client networks, monumental public religion, and trade-dependent economies, created pathways for conflict. When pressure rose, the system's interconnections could spread failure as quickly as they had once spread power.
The Maya world was never simply jungle waiting to be cleared. It was a complex mosaic of managed forests, seasonal wetlands, terraces, and cultivated plots. A landscape shaped by generations of human decisions as much as by rainfall and soil. Archaeologists today emphasize that Maya farmers used a suite of adaptive strategies: milpa polyculture, raised fields, terracing, and managed forest gardens to wrest stable yields from soils that were often thin, leached, or seasonally waterlogged. Maize was the agricultural backbone. Multiple varieties were planted in association with beans and squash to maintain soil fertility and dietary balance. Milpa systems, rooted in long-standing indigenous practice, rotated plots through cycles of cultivation and fallow, and were flexible enough to work across the lowland mosaics of bajos, ridges, and riverine terraces. Paleoecological studies, pollen records, charcoal layers, and soil chemistry show increasing maize signatures in the landscape as settlements grew, but they also indicate long-term investments in land management rather than simple, unsustainable slash and burn. The Maya did engineer the land at scale. In the Mirador Basin and elsewhere, archaeologists have documented monumental earthworks, causeways, reservoirs, and raised agricultural surfaces, which required planned labor and a knowledge of hydrology. In the Corozal and Payton regions, raised fields and canals converted seasonally flooded bajos into productive ground. In upland zones, terraces stabilized slopes and conserved soil. These land-desk investments reveal long-term planning and multi-generational stewardship as part of the agricultural repertoire. But these systems carried trade-offs. Intensive cultivation to support dense populations demanded continuous labor and careful water management. Reservoirs and cisterns could buffer short dry spells, but prolonged multi-year droughts, like those reconstructed in several paleoclimate records for the Terminal Classic, strained storage systems and reduced harvests across broad regions. High-resolution stalagmite and lake sediment studies have identified clusters of severe droughts in the 8th to 10th century CE that align with archaeological signals of decline at many southern lowland sites. The paleoclimate story is now rich and layered. Classic studies identified a pattern of severe, sometimes recurring droughts during the Terminal Classic, approximately AD 760 to 900, and more recent stalagmite work has added fine seasonal detail, showing that some droughts extended for several years and hit during the wet season when maize relied on rains most heavily. These climatic pressures reduced yields, heightened food insecurity, and magnified the political consequences of failed harvests. Yet climate alone is not a complete explanation. Environmental archaeology complicates simple narratives of ecological collapse by showing regional variation. Some areas show clear signs of deforestation and erosion, while others display managed forest continuity
and intentional landscape engineering. Studies disputing wholesale, catastrophic deforestation point out that pollen, charcoal, and phytolith records often reflect selective clearing, agroforestry practices, and long-term tree cultivation, rather than a single sweep of environmental destruction. The result? Vulnerability differed by place and by the specific practices communities used.
Population scale matters here. New LiDAR surveys have dramatically revised our sense of how many people the lowlands supported, revealing dense settlement networks, terraces, and small civic plazas where earlier surveys saw wilderness. Revised population estimates, substantially higher than mid-20th century guesses, imply that agricultural systems were operating at near maximum capacity in many regions by the late Classic, reducing the margin for error when drought or political disruption hit. High population densities amplified the stakes of any prolonged production shortfall. Water management was central to resilience. In karst landscapes of the northern peninsula, where surface water is scarce, cenotes, chultuns, rock-cut cisterns, and reservoirs were essential. In the southern lowlands, seasonal bajos and river systems provided groundwater recharge but required careful timing to capture and store wet season inflows. When drought interrupted recharge cycles, reservoirs could fall short. When warfare blocked access to fields or waterworks were neglected, communities felt the effects quickly. Archaeological surveys find abandoned reservoirs and neglected canals at precisely the times when other stress signals rise, suggesting that social disruption impaired the very infrastructure people depended on. Soil degradation was another local concern. On slopes and in intensively farmed valleys, erosion and nutrient depletion could reduce yields over decades. Techniques such as terracing, soil amendments, and the recycling of organic wastes mitigated decline, but these measures required labor and institutional continuity. When polities could still organize labor through ritual obligation, corvée taxes, or communal workdays, soil regeneration could be managed. When political authority frayed, the maintenance regime often collapsed with it. The archaeological record shows cycles where terraces fall into disrepair after civic collapse. Disease and demographic shifts also entered the environmental equation. Recent genetic and bioarchaeological studies indicate population declines beginning around the 8th century in some regions, and while causes are complex, including migration, warfare, and malnutrition, they fed back into agricultural capacity. Fewer hands to maintain intensive infrastructure or a sudden influx of refugees into marginal lands could both stress a landscape. Genomic analyses from sites like Copan show demographic contraction during the Terminal Classic, supporting the picture of a stressed and changing population. The political economy of food intensified vulnerability. Elite-sponsored monumental projects, pyramids, ball courts, and stelae, consumed labor and grain. The ritual calendar demanded feasting and offerings at specific times. Failure to meet those obligations could undermine a ruler's sacral legitimacy. In times of crop shortfall, leaders faced agonizing trade-offs: divert grain to maintain ritual performance and risk household famine, or curtail ceremony and risk losing political authority. These choices were not abstract. They were lived decisions that could accelerate social unrest and breakdown. Regional differentiation shaped outcomes. The Petén lowlands, with their heavy reliance on seasonal wetlands and complicated hydrology, saw dramatic abandonments in certain basins where drought and warfare combined. In contrast, some northern Yucatan centers adapted through trade networks or flexible reliance on groundwater and coastal resources, enabling resilience in places like Chichen Itza, which maintained prominence into the post-Classic. Thus, environmental stress produced varied responses: collapse in some arenas, reorganization in others. Archaeologists increasingly emphasize the idea of coupled human-environment systems. social decisions shape environmental outcomes, which in turn feed back on social structures. For the Maya, centuries of landscape manipulation created both opportunities and liabilities. Systems that produced surplus during good years, dense settlements tied to long-distance trade and courtly ritual, could become Achilles' heels when climate or political shocks removed the buffers that once smoothed variability. Importantly, adaptation was real and visible. Evidence from terracing, agroforestry, household gardens, and wetland modification shows that Maya communities were inventive and deliberate in their agricultural choices. In many instances, communities invested in labor-intensive, sustainable infrastructure that preserved soil and captured water. The problem was scale and timing. When climatic extremes clustered and political cohesion eroded, local successes could not always be scaled quickly or coordinated region-wide. Archaeobotanical data also showed diet diversification and fallback strategies. People supplemented maize with wild resources, root crops, and domesticates when available. Storage and food redistribution networks enabled some communities to survive short shocks. But the archaeological and paleoclimatic alignment during the Terminal Classic suggests that when droughts became multi-year and widespread, even diversified diets and storage could not prevent systemic stress. What this means for the narrative of collapse is crucial. Environmental factors, drought, soil stress, water scarcity, were powerful contributors, but they worked through social and political channels. Drought did not automatically topple a state. It degraded its capacity to perform, to feed, and to legitimize power. Where institutions remained flexible, where trade and water storage buffered shortages, communities adapted. Where institutions were brittle, where warfare or elite mismanagement disrupted maintenance and redistribution, environmental shocks could become catastrophic. In short, the fragile balance with nature was a central axis of Maya history. Environmental ingenuity made large cities possible, but the same dependence on managed landscapes exposed polities to severe risk when climate and social order shifted.
The unraveling of classic Maya life was not a sudden apocalypse, but a long, uneven process, a patchwork of localized collapses, migration pulses, and institutional failures that played out across centuries. In some regions, whole cities emptied within decades. In others, settlement patterns shifted without total abandonment. What we call the collapse is best understood as many collapses, connected by politics, ecology, and human choices. By the late 7th and into the 8th century CE, indicators of stress begin to accumulate in the archaeological record. Monument erection slows and then stops in many southern lowland centers. Stelae that once recorded detailed dynastic sequences are left uncarved. Public architecture is left incomplete, construction deposits thin, and the visible theater of royal performance, plazas filled with ritual life, begins to quieten. These are not poetic metaphors, but measurable changes archaeologists read in stone and stratigraphy. The chronological match between cultural signals and environmental data is striking. High-resolution paleoclimate records, stalagmites and lake sediments, register extended multi-year droughts in the Terminal Classic period, roughly AD 760 to 900. Clustered episodes that would have reduced crop yields and strained water systems across large portions of the lowlands. Where communities depended on seasonal rains and surface reservoirs, protracted dry years would have been devastating. But drought alone is insufficient as an explanatory monocause. The archaeological record shows warfare increasing in many regions at the same time. Fortifications, burned palaces, and mass evidence of violent destruction appear in places like the Petex Batun and the central lowlands. These patterns suggest that social rupture and competition for dwindling resources were mutually reinforcing. As food and water became scarcer, political tensions rose. As political systems frayed, infrastructure maintenance and redistribution faltered, worsening scarcity. In the Petex Batun, the sequence is painfully clear.
Cities such as Dos Pilas, Aguateca, and neighboring centers experienced chronic warfare in the late Classic. Archaeological excavations reveal burned royal palaces, hurriedly abandoned household deposits, and skeletal evidence of trauma. The region's collapse is one of the most detailed case studies we have. Here, warfare, elite flight, and social breakdown are archaeologically visible, and they occur within the broader period of climate stress. The human story inside those burned layers is immediate. When a palace burned, it meant the end of a fiscal and ritual hub that organized labor, stored grain, and administered waterworks. When elites fled their compounds, the institutional knowledge that maintained terraces, canals, and reservoirs often left with them. Without that social organization, the corvée labor, the scribes and priests who scheduled repairs, infrastructure fell into disrepair, and communities lost the very buffers that had helped them survive short-term shortages. Elsewhere, abrupt shifts in settlement patterns tell a different tale. Some populations consolidated into more defensible hilltop sites or clustered around remaining water sources. Defensive architecture and hastily dug ditches become common in many places, revealing an increased focus on security. Household archaeology shows more fortified compounds and fewer signs of long-term high-investment public building projects. People were reallocating labor towards survival and defense rather than monumentality. The economics of ritual intensified pressure. Classic rulers maintained social control through a system of performance, feasting, ceremonies, and dated monuments. These performances required grain, craft goods, and labor. During multi-year droughts, the cost of maintaining ritual life could outstrip available food reserves. Leaders faced brutal calculus: continue public rites to preserve legitimacy and risk starvation at household levels, or curtail ceremony and risk the loss of authority. In many centers, those trade-offs appear to have accelerated political disintegration. The epigraphic record adds human names and dates to this story. Where stelae continue, they sometimes record violent events, capture of rulers, defeat in battle, or the end of lineage lines. Inscriptions also reveal episodes of political realignment, vassal rulers changing patrons, foreign interventions, and dynastic terminations. These textual traces make collapse legible as a political process, not merely an environmental phenomenon. Migration was a central element of the unfolding collapse. As southern lowland cities shrank, people moved, sometimes short distances to nearby hinterlands, sometimes farther north toward the Yucatan Peninsula. This migration changed the demographic landscape. Population densities fell in some basins and rose in others. In the northern peninsula, different hydrology and access to coastal resources supported the growth of new centers, even as the southern heartland depopulated. The archaeological signature of migration, abandoned fields, domestic refuse left in situ, and ephemeral camps, appears alongside evidence for social reorganization. In some places, household economies became more insular. In others, new forms of local leadership emerged. Not all migrations were catastrophic. Some represent adaptive rescaling of social life. But when migration happened under duress, during sieges, or after crop failures, it added to instability by concentrating people in marginal zones and placing stress on local resources. Disease and nutrition also factored into the cascade. Bioarchaeology indicates episodes of stress, higher rates of enamel hypoplasia, markers of childhood malnutrition, evidence for anemia, and changing mortality patterns during the terminal classic. Malnutrition lowers a population's resilience to both environmental shocks and social stress, making communities more vulnerable to epidemics and undermining labor availability when maintenance of infrastructure is most needed.
The fiscal collapse of elite systems is another piece of the puzzle, where tribute flows from hinterlands diminished, from lost fields, refocused labor, or violent defection. Elites lost the material base that underpinned courtly life. Artisans stopped receiving patronage, scribes lost commissions, and public construction ceased.
This breakdown of elite economies unstitched the ceremonial fabric that had long legitimized authority. Regional variation remained a defining feature. While the southern lowlands saw dramatic abandonments in many basins, some regions demonstrated resilience. Cities on the northern peninsula, or those with strong coastal trade networks, like Chichen Itza during the Terminal Classic, adapted strategies that mitigated drought impacts. Trade bringing in food, exploitation of coastal resources, or flexible political coalitions. These differences remind us that the outcomes were contingent on local ecology, political structure, and networks of exchange. New technologies in survey and remote sensing have sharpened our picture of the collapse. LiDAR surveys revealed dense rural settlement and landscape modification that earlier researchers underestimated. Those higher population estimates imply the agricultural systems were closer to their carrying capacity than previously thought, reducing margins of error when drought or conflict occurred. In short, the Maya were more numerous and more intensively settled, which makes the economic and ecological shocks of the Terminal Classic even more consequential. The archaeological sequence often shows a particular tempo. Decades of increasing stress with episodic violence, followed by rapid abandonment in certain centers. In some cases, site abandonment is sudden and archaeologically visible. Domestic items left behind, food stores uncollected, and unfinished constructions. In others, decline is gradual. Fewer monuments, reoccupation of public spaces for domestic use, and the rise of smaller-scale community centers. Both patterns reflect different combinations of ecological, political, and social pressures. Importantly, cultural memory did not vanish. Even as classic courts failed, many aspects of Maya identity, language, ritual practice, agricultural knowledge, persisted. Descendant communities carried forward traditions, adapted crops and calendars, and remade social worlds in new environments. The apparent disappearance of classic cities thus conceals long continuities. People endured, learned, and rerouted their ways of life in different political forms. Recent stalagmite studies sharpen the climactic detail, showing multiple closely spaced wet season droughts during the Terminal Classic that would have been especially harmful to maize-based agriculture. When dry seasons lengthened and rainy seasons failed repeatedly, even sophisticated water storage systems could be overwhelmed. The combined effect of these climactic pulses with social disruptions helps explain why many southern lowland centers could not recover. The final chapters of the collapse often include acts of erasure and reuse. In some centers, later occupants mined stone from ceremonial buildings. In others, new rulers recarved older monuments to legitimize their power. These palimpsests in stone record both loss and adaptation, societies negotiating memory even as political structures transformed. Archaeologists reading these layered traces reconstruct not only abandonment, but the creative responses that followed. To understand the collapse is to accept complexity. It was a process where environmental stress, political competition, social choices, and demographic pressures braided together. No single cause explains every local pattern. Instead, we see multiple interacting drivers that varied by place and time. That complexity is not a failure of explanation, but an honest reflection of human history's contingent nature. As we stand in the quiet of an abandoned plaza, it is tempting to see only ruin. But the archaeological layers tell a fuller story, of people coping with famine and war, of elites making impossible choices, of communities migrating and adapting. The collapse unfolds, not as a single dramatic fall, but as a sequence of transformations, some ending cities, others reconfiguring culture, whose consequences shaped Mesoamerica for centuries to come.
When the great southern capitals emptied, people did not vanish. They moved, regrouped, and rerouted their lives where water, trade, and new opportunities promised continuity. Between roughly the 9th and 12th centuries CE, this movement produced one of the most consequential demographic pivots in Maya history, a broad migration from the southern lowlands toward the northern Yucatan and coastal zones, where new political formations and economic strategies emerged. The northern Yucatan offered different ecological conditions. Unlike the southern lowland basins that relied heavily on seasonal rains and extensive wetland management, the peninsula's karstic plain had scarce surface water but numerous cenotes and a coastline that connected communities by sea. These features made the north attractive to migrants. Groundwater in cenotes provided reliable drinking water in many localities, and maritime routes opened access to coastal resources and trade networks that could buffer agricultural shortfalls on land. Chichen Itza is one of the clearest manifestations of this northern flowering. Archaeological sequence and inscriptions show a late classic to terminal classic reorientation. The city's monumental core developed significantly between the 8th and 10th centuries, and by the 10th century, Chichen Itza is a major regional capital, drawing influence from both central lowland traditions and northern coastal trade. Some architectural and iconographic elements even suggest interaction with central Mexican influences and with itinerant warrior merchants who used the sea to connect regions. Chichen Itza's success was not simply political theater. It rested on pragmatic advantages. The city controlled cenotes, most famously the sacred cenote, which were not only ritual foci, but crucial water sources for large populations and for agriculture in the surrounding milpas. These hydrological assets, combined with long-distance exchange in commodities like salt, cotton, and marine products, let northern centers play a different economic game than their southern rain-dependent predecessors. The rise of Chichen Itza does not erase regional diversity. Coastal ports, Puic hill towns, and emerging polities across the peninsula displayed a range of adaptive strategies. Some invested in terracing and water capture, others leveraged sea lanes and trade partnerships. The Puic region, for example, shows an architectural boom and complex settlement networks that indicate local elites harnessing both agriculture and craft production in service of expanding polities. LIDAR and survey work have revealed dense settlement patterns in several northern zones, implying a substantial rural base supporting urban cores. Migration was often pragmatic and mixed in scale. Families headed to nearby towns, whole corporate groups, craftspeople, priestly lineages, or minor elites relocated en masse, and some military or merchant networks moved strategically to control coastal nodes. These shifts altered social constitutions. Some political orders in the north incorporated newcomers by offering shared ritual spaces and marketplaces, while others maintained tighter control by walling and policing urban cores. Mayapan, later in the post-classic, would exemplify a tightly governed, walled polity built from networks of allied lineages. Mayapan's rise in the 12th-13th centuries marked the second wave in the peninsula's political life, where Chichen Itza dominated in the terminal classic and early post-classic. Mayapan later became a centralizing force from c. 1220 to the mid-15th century, reorganizing regional lordships under federated rule centered in a fortified, walled city. Ethno-historical sources and archaeological surveys estimate Mayapan's walled compound held many thousands of residents and controlled an extensive hinterland, a political model suited to an era when trade, lineage coalitions, and defensive organization mattered. The northern shift also changed economic lifeways. Coastal trade networks expanded. Marine resources, salted fish, shell, and turtle products entered staple diets and markets, and commodities like salt became strategic goods. Maritime exchange allowed northern polities to import maize and other staples during shortages, reducing their vulnerability to isolated droughts that would have devastated interior basins dependent on rain capture. That said, prolonged peninsula-wide dry spells still posed risks even to these more trade-integrated systems. Recent stalagmite studies confirm severe, repeated wet season droughts during the Terminal Classic and later periods that stressed both northern and southern systems in different ways. LIDAR and field surveys have revised our sense of the demographic scale of these movements. Where earlier research underestimated rural densities, laser mapping has revealed extensive road networks, terracing, and household clusters in both the lowlands and northern regions, which implies migration did not empty the landscape but redistributed populations across a more complex settlement matrix. These findings complicate older narratives that spoke of emptiness after collapse. Instead, they show active reorganization, demographically dense hinterlands, and continuity of many agricultural practices.
The cultural consequences were profound. Migrants carried rituals, craft forms, and manuscript traditions northward. Conversely, northern innovations fed back into the south via trade and intermarriage. This cultural flow explains the hybrid architectural styles and iconographic blends seen at sites like Chichen Itza, where Puuc stonework sits beside central Mexican motifs and where coastal elements coexist with inland ritual forms. The post-collapse world was not a return to a single pure tradition, but a remixing of regional repertoires. Political reconfiguration in the north favored different governance models. Instead of the divine kingly courts that dominated many classic southern polities, some northern centers relied more on councils of lords, federations, or martial oligarchies. Mayapan's walled city and its system of shared rule among lineage heads is one example. Chichen Itza's apparent incorporation of military elites and merchant classes is another. These systems could marshal labor and trade without always requiring the same scale of ritual performance that bound classic courts. Not all migration was voluntary or peaceful. Warfare, raiding, and elite takeovers in the south forced many to flee. Famine prompted others to seek fields or markets where food could be bought or exchanged for coastal goods. Refugee flows introduced tensions. Sudden population influxes strained local resources, sometimes provoking conflict between newcomers and established communities. Yet in many places, pragmatic accommodation produced blended communities where knowledge exchange of water capture techniques, craft skills, and ritual meanings enabled survival. The long-term demographic consequence was complex. While some southern basins depopulated dramatically, the broader Maya cultural world persisted and even flourished in new forms. Northern centers could sustain urban life for centuries afterward, although their political fortunes waxed and waned. Archaeological and ethno-historical evidence shows lineage continuity, language persistence, and the survival of ritual calendars across these transformations, proof that migration was creative as well as disruptive. Scholars now see the migration and northern shift not as an end, but as a redirection of Maya energy and organization. The demographic realignment opened different political possibilities: fortified cities, maritime confederacies, and marketplaces that connected interior and coast. These new forms reshaped Mesoamerican trade and politics well into the post-classic and the early contact period, influencing how Maya society met Spanish arrival centuries later. Importantly, recent scholarship highlights recovery as well as movement. LIDAR-enabled surveys and renewed fieldwork show that by the post-classic, many northern regions exhibited renewed population density and agricultural intensification, indicating not only migration but demographic recovery and local resilience. Studies from 2024 to 2025 emphasize that northern Maya populations rebound and reorganize after the Terminal Classic, creating vibrant polities that integrated migrants and locals into new economic and political systems. For ordinary people, migration meant new networks and new livelihoods. A farmer from the southern Petén might become a craftsman in a Puuc town, a trader on a coastal canoe, or a tenant in a growing northern agrarian hinterland. Ritual specialists adapted ceremonies to new landscapes and new water sources. Language and social memory preserved a living link to classic pasts, even as communities retooled for survival. The Maya story here is one of continuity through transformation. As we look back across centuries, the Great Migration and Northern Shift appear not as a single exodus, but as a series of migrations, realignments, and recoveries that reshaped the Maya world. The southern lowland cities did not simply die. Their people carried knowledge, ritual, and resilience into new geographies where new political orders emerged. The northern landscape absorbed and recombined these threads into a dynamic, adaptive civilization that would persist into the early modern era.
The arrival of Europeans in the early 16th century introduced pressures the Maya world had never faced. Firearms, steel, new political alliances, missionary campaigns, and pathogens against which indigenous immunities offered little defense. The encounter was not a single sweeping conquest, but a long, uneven process of intermittent warfare, negotiated submission, conversion, and resistance that stretched across more than a century and a half. Contact began in fits and starts. Spanish expeditions that toppled the Aztec Empire in central Mexico in the 1520s sent veteran conquistadors and their indigenous allies into neighboring highlands and lowlands. Pedro de Alvarado led campaigns into the Guatemalan highlands in 1524, installing new colonial centers and breaking resistance among highland Maya polities with a mixture of military force and indigenous alliances. These early campaigns established the model the Spanish would use repeatedly: combine superior weaponry and cavalry with rival native forces, then consolidate control through towns and encomienda systems. The Yucatan Peninsula proved more stubborn. The Crown granted Francisco de Montejo the rights to conquer and settle Yucatan in 1526 to 1527, launching decades of campaigning, negotiation, and repeated reversals. Spanish forces founded early colonial towns in the 1540s, notably Mérida in 1542, but conquest there was neither quick nor total. The peninsula's dispersed polities, difficult karstic terrain, and resilient Maya social networks meant that Spanish control often depended on local agreements, tributary arrangements, and the steady work of missionaries and town building over generations, rather than a single decisive battlefield victory. Disease was an invisible conqueror that moved ahead of soldiers. Smallpox, measles, and other Old World pathogens reached indigenous Mesoamerica within years of first contact, and spread rapidly along trade routes and through interactions between communities. While precise mortality figures vary by region and source, scholars have shown that epidemics dramatically reduced indigenous populations across the 16th century, undermining social resilience, disrupting agricultural production, and weakening the capacity of communities to resist or recover from military campaigns. Disease thus amplified the impact of Spanish military and administrative incursions. The Spanish colonial strategy combined military force with religious conversion and administrative reorganization. Friars, Dominican, Franciscan, and later secular clergy, established missions to baptize and acculturate indigenous populations, often in parallel with the imposition of encomiendas, a system that allocated indigenous labor to Spanish settlers. Missionization changed ritual life. Churches replaced plazas as focal points of public religion, and old priestly offices were suppressed or co-opted. Over decades, Catholic institutions remade public ritual calendars and redistributed ceremonial focus toward Christian sacraments. Resistance persisted for centuries. Across the Maya world, varying degrees of armed opposition, flight to remote highlands and forest refuges, and cultural adaptation defined local responses. Some polities negotiated peace treaties and client relationships with the Spanish. Others resisted fiercely. The Lacandon, the Itza,
The Petén Itzá and various Chiapas highland groups held out, retreating into wilderness strongholds that complicated Spanish attempts at total domination. These pockets of resistance meant that, even as much of Mesoamerica fell under colonial control in the 16th century, autonomous Maya polities survived well into the 17th century. Economically, colonial demands transformed Maya life. Tribute requirements, labor drafts, and the reorientation of production toward colonial markets restructured household economies. The encomienda and repartimiento systems compelled labor for mines, plantations, and public works. Forced relocation to Spanish-style towns reorganized settlement patterns, and tribute in kind or labor redirected surplus away from local redistribution toward colonial consumption. These shifts compounded the stresses already placed on communities by disease and ecological strain. Spanish campaigns continued piecemeal for decades. In the Guatemalan highlands and Pacific slopes, Alvarado and his lieutenants pacified many regions by the mid-1520s, but other areas required protracted campaigns. The lowland Petén, a heartland of late Maya resilience, resisted intrusions for generations. It was only in the final decades of the 17th century that the last independent Itzá kingdom, centered on the island capital of Noch Petén, also called Tayasal, on Lake Petén Itzá, was taken by Spanish forces. That final conquest in March 1697 marked the end of overt political independence for the pre-Columbian Maya polities.
The fall of Noch Petén is a stark closing chapter. In 1697, Martín de Ursúa y Arizmendi led a well-prepared Spanish expedition from the newly established colonial center of Santiago de Guatemala to Lake Petén Itzá. After establishing a fortified position on the shore and building a launchable warboat, Spanish forces bombarded the island city on March 10th. The assault and its aftermath, death, flight, and forced baptisms, effectively ended the last major independent Maya kingdom, folding the Petén into colonial Guatemala. The siege illustrates how, by the late 17th century, Spanish military logistics and colonial will combined to eliminate even the most resilient holdouts. Military superiority mattered, but so did alliances and local fractures. Spanish campaigns often succeeded by exploiting rivalries among indigenous groups, recruiting native auxiliaries who had political incentives to side with the Europeans. These alliances could prove decisive in capturing and pacifying regions, illustrating that conquest was as much political brokerage as it was force of arms. In many cases, native allies exacted their own reprisals or sought to reshape regional hierarchies in the wake of Spanish victory. Beyond military and epidemiological dimensions, cultural transformation was profound. Missionaries systematically destroyed idols, suppressed indigenous priesthoods, and replaced native rituals with Christian rites. Material culture changed as European goods, metal tools, horses, textiles, entered daily life and trade. Yet syncretism also emerged. Many Maya communities blended Christian symbols with indigenous cosmologies, preserving elements of ancestral ritual inside new forms. Languages endured. Maya tongues continued to be spoken, and many pre-Columbian practices, agricultural knowledge, and calendar systems survived in adapted forms within colonial society. The legal and administrative apparatus of the Spanish crown further altered Maya lives. The Indies institutions, municipal councils, Spanish magistrates, and royal courts imposed new legal categories and property regimes. Spanish law also provided rhetorical protections for indigenous subjects, as in the debate sparked by Bartolomé de las Casas, but in practice, coercive labor and land expropriation often dominated. Over time, indigenous communities navigated these institutions, sometimes using colonial courts to defend land rights, other times being dispossessed by settlers and colonial officials. Demography remained a central factor in the colonial transformation. Epidemics continued in waves through the 16th and 17th centuries, and combined with warfare and dispossession, they produced dramatic population declines across Mesoamerica. These demographic collapses undermined labor supplies, disrupted kin-based social structures, and reshaped settlement patterns. While some regions recovered numerically over generations, the immediate centuries following contact were defined by profound population loss and social dislocation. Resistance and revolt persisted despite these pressures. Throughout the colonial period, there were anti-colonial uprisings, clandestine retention of ritual practices, and episodes of flight to remote highlands and forests. The persistence of independent or semi-independent Maya communities into the 17th century shows that the process of colonization was negotiated and contested. In some frontier regions, Spanish control fluctuated for decades, only consolidating when colonial institutions could project sustained military and bureaucratic power. The ecological consequences of colonialism also reshaped landscapes. Colonial agriculture, cattle ranching, and new market demands transformed land use. Forests were cleared at different scales, and colonial extractive economies, particularly in areas integrated into silver and commodity circuits, altered local ecologies and labor regimes. These environmental changes intertwined with social transformations, creating new vulnerabilities, even as some communities adapted and found niches within the colonial order. By the time Noj Peten fell in 1697, the map of Mesoamerica had been radically redrawn. The great classic courts were gone as political centers, their monuments abandoned or repurposed, and Maya polities existed largely within colonial administrative frameworks, though cultural, linguistic, and religious continuities persisted. The Spanish conquest thus marks an end to sovereign pre-Columbian polity in most areas, but not the extinction of Maya peoples or traditions. The indigenous world remade itself under new constraints, carrying memory, ritual, and language into the colonial present. Modern scholarship complicates older simplistic narratives of a monolithic final fall. Historians and archaeologists emphasize instead a longue durée of encounter. Early military blows, demographic collapse from disease, missionary conversion and town founding, decades of negotiation and resistance, and a final phase in which colonial administrations and military expeditions closed remaining refuges. This layered perspective helps explain regional variation and why some Maya communities maintained degrees of autonomy far longer than others. The human cost was enormous. Lives lost to violence and disease, social networks fractured, and political institutions transformed. But survival and adaptation were also central. Maya descendants maintained languages, agricultural knowledge, crafts, and ritual calendars. Over centuries, these living traditions fed revival, syncretism, and sustained identity that survived the colonial centuries and continue into the present. The final fall is therefore both an end of pre-Columbian sovereignty and the starting point of a resilient colonial-era Maya experience. As we close this chapter, imagine a landscape where mission churches cast long shadows over ancient plazas, where cenotes supply water to towns newly organized under Spanish law, and where families carry both memory and adaptation in their songs and seed banks. The arrival of outsiders and the final fall are tragic and transformative, a period when old polities ended and new colonial worlds began. But the Maya story continues, written in languages, rituals, and communities that endured and adapted across centuries.
The story of rediscovery begins in the 19th century, when Western eyes first recorded the scale and artistry of Maya monuments hidden beneath canopy and myth. In the 1839 to 1841 travels of John Lloyd Stephens and the breathtaking illustrations of Frederick Catherwood, the world encountered Palenque, Copan, Uxmal, and Chichen Itza as complex urban places rather than mysterious single ruins. Their published accounts, richly illustrated and widely read, turned remote jungle sites into global objects of curiosity and study. Those first visitors were adventurers and antiquarians more than modern archaeologists. Machetes, sketchbooks, and romantic prose shaped how the ruins were presented to readers who had never crossed an ocean. But their work mattered because it preserved visual records of monuments at moments when centuries of weathering and human reuse had already altered them. Catherwood's drawings, in particular, furnished high-quality plans and elevations that later archaeologists would rely on to ask new questions about construction phases and iconographic meaning. The transition to scientific archaeology began in the late 19th century. Figures like Alfred P. Maudsley applied methods of careful measurement, casting, and photographic documentation that set new standards. Maudsley's surveys, soundings, and casts of stelae and reliefs created archival records and introduced systematic approaches, stratigraphic observations, epigraphic squeezes, and architectural recording that transformed heroic exploration into repeatable scholarship. His work established a professional baseline for subsequent investigations. Parallel to foreign investigators, local and regional actors, hacienda owners, rubber tappers, and indigenous guides played indispensable roles in discovery and preservation. Explorers such as Teoberto Mahler documented ruins with careful photography and published notes that bridged the gap between romantic travel literature and professional fieldwork. The rediscovery of many sites depended on local knowledge. Requests to chicleros, laborers, and villagers often led archaeologists to forgotten plazas and remote stelae. The early 20th century saw institutional investment and long-term projects. The Carnegie Institution, the Peabody Museum, and various national institutes funded excavations, stabilization, and epigraphic programs. Sylvanus G. Morley and others led systematic field seasons at places like Chichen Itza, Huachactún, and Copan, pairing excavation with reconstruction, publication, and education. These decades consolidated the ruins into archaeological sites and museums and trained a generation of specialists in inscriptions, ceramics, and architecture. Even with careful excavations, however, many of the Maya's most vital clues lay in the glyphs carved on stone, and for much of the early 20th century, those signs resisted full comprehension. The assumption among many scholars was that glyphs were largely calendrical or ritual shorthand, not historical narrative. That view changed dramatically in the mid-20th century, when scholars demonstrated that inscriptions recorded events and dynastic histories. Tatiana Proskuriakov's careful analysis of stelae and sculpted panels showed that long count dates corresponded to concrete birth, accession, and death dates of rulers, opening the door to reading Maya history in their own words. Her breakthroughs reframed monuments as archives of political action.
Once the inscriptions were recognized as historical, epigraphers accelerated the decipherment of the script. Over the second half of the 20th century, teams of linguists, archaeologists, and art historians, combining typological study, phonetic analysis, and comparative language work, progressively solved glyphic signs and grammar. This intellectual labor converted stone sentences into biographies, wars, treaties, and genealogies, transforming carved plazas into readable chronicles and situating Maya polities within precise chronological frameworks. Rediscovery was as much about methods as it was about people. The shift from anecdotal collecting to stratigraphic excavation, from aesthetic description to context-based analysis, created the conditions for robust interpretation. Archaeologists began to classify ceramics, trace trade networks by sourcing obsidian and jade, and reconstruct settlement patterns through survey. Ethnohistoric sources, colonial documents, and indigenous oral traditions also entered the scholarly conversation, adding nuance to how archaeologists connected stone to social life. Technological advances continued to rewrite the map of what was possible. Where 19th century explorers cleared brush with machetes, 21st century teams used remote sensing. The real revolution came with airborne LiDAR, light detection and ranging. laser pulses fired from aircraft that penetrate canopy to reveal the ground surface in extraordinary detail. LiDAR surveys flown over Guatemala and Mexico in the 2010s exposed dense settlement networks, causeways, terraces, and reservoirs on a scale previously unimaginable, demonstrating that the Maya lowlands were a far more intensively engineered and populated landscape than earlier fieldwork suggested. The Pacunam and related LiDAR projects, announced widely in 2018, delivered maps showing tens of thousands of previously undetected structures, from small households to major roadways linking cities into regional systems. These data forced archaeologists to reassess population estimates, landscape management, and the logistical capacities of classic Maya polities. Far from scattered ceremonial centers surrounded by wilderness, the LiDAR results revealed interlocking networks of fields, roads, and dispersed habitation that made earlier pristine forest assumptions untenable. LiDAR is not magic. It does not replace groundwork, but it magnifies and focuses field archaeology. After LiDAR identifies features, teams return to map, test, and date them, integrating remote sensing with stratigraphy, radiocarbon analysis, and ceramic chronology. This synergy has led to discoveries of previously unknown monumental centers, refined understandings of agricultural intensification, and better reconstructions of transport and defensive systems. In essence, LiDAR and follow-up excavation turned rediscovery into a disciplined, large-scale revision of Maya landscape history. Recent interdisciplinary projects show the field is still renewing itself. Large collaborative LiDAR analyses published through the 2020s have continued to expand mapped areas and refine interpretations. A 2025 multi-institutional study combining Tulane University, Universitat Politécnica de Valencia, and the Pacunam Consortium identified over 100,000 structures across more than 2,600 square kilometers, indicating dense, socially complex settlement patterns and challenging older models of elite concentration. These contemporary results underscore that each technological leap brings a new wave of rediscovery and reinterpretation. Rediscovery also reshaped public engagement. Stevens and Catherwood had started a consumer fascination. Later 19th and early 20th century publications, museum exhibits, and photographs broadened public imagination about the Maya. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, blockbuster exhibitions, popular books, and documentary films, now enriched by epigraphic translation and LiDAR visualizations, made complex archaeological stories accessible to millions. That public interest has spurred preservation efforts and funding, but it also raises ethical questions about site tourism, repatriation, and indigenous stewardship. Importantly, rediscovery is not a one-way extraction of past artifacts into foreign museums. From the late 20th century onward, descendant Maya communities and national governments have asserted leadership in research, conservation, and interpretation. Collaborative archaeology, community archaeology, and capacity building aim to center indigenous voices in how sites are presented, conserved, and linked to contemporary cultural life. Repatriation efforts, bilingual site interpretation, and joint management underscore that rediscovery must respect living descendants and their claims to heritage. The practice of epigraphy has likewise deepened the story. Where early researchers saw only monuments, later scholars, aided by Proskuriakov's insights and decades of epigraphic work, read dynastic sequences, political treaties, and references to long-distance diplomacy and ritual. We now know the names of many rulers, the years of their reigns, and the stories they chose to commemorate. These readable histories complicate romantic notions of a purely ritual civilizational collapse by revealing political calculations, official propaganda, and episodes of intercity negotiation embedded in stone. Rediscovery also redrew the timeline. Radiocarbon dating, ceramic seriation, and improved stratigraphic methods have allowed archaeologists to place architectural phases and inscriptional events into precise centuries and even years. That chronological precision ties classic monuments to climate proxies, stalagmites, lake cores, and pollen sequences, enabling nuanced arguments about when droughts, warfare, and migration intersected. The result is a far more integrated, evidence-based narrative of Maya history than was possible a century ago. Yet rediscovery is not without critique. Early explorers sometimes removed artifacts or published sensationalized accounts that exoticized indigenous cultures. 20th century restoration projects occasionally reconstructed monuments in ways that later judged to be intrusive. Modern scholarship therefore grapples with ethical lessons, how to balance preservation, tourism, and research, how to collaborate with descendant communities, and how to use new technologies responsibly without turning sites into laboratory curiosities. These debates are part of an ethical modern rediscovery practice. The cumulative effect of 2 centuries of rediscovery is profound. From Stevens and Catherwood's first plates to Maudsley's casts, from Proskoriakov's decipherment to 21st century LIDAR megasurveys, each era of inquiry has opened new registers of meaning. The Maya past has moved from the status of picturesque ruins to an empirically grounded civilization with known rulers, calendars, trade routes, and adaptive strategies. A civilization whose rise, transformation, and resilience we can now narrate with both data and empathy. For viewers and learners today, rediscovery is an invitation to read inscriptions that speak in dates and names, to walk landscapes mapped by LIDAR that reveal fields and causeways, and to listen to descendant Maya communities who carry ritual and agricultural knowledge across centuries. It is an ongoing project, not a finished archive, where new methods, respectful collaboration, and community involvement continue to bring the past into sharper focus.
The silence that drapes over ruined plazas is not the silence of extinction, but of transformation. The classic courts and monumental capitals of the southern lowlands largely ceased their old rhythms between the 8th and 10th centuries, but that archaeological silence sits beside centuries of human continuity. People who reshaped their lives, moved across landscapes, and kept languages, seeds, and rituals alive. The story we have told of political intensity, environmental challenge, migration, and colonial contact is complex because the causes were multiple and interacting. Modern scholarship stresses this complexity. Drought, warfare, social breakdown, and institutional failures combined in different measures across regions and decades. No single cause explains every local outcome. That nuance matters because it reframes collapse as a set of cascading transformations rather than a single, universal catastrophe. The final political fall of independent polities came slowly and fitfully, culminating in events like the Spanish assault on Noj Petén in 1697, a decisive military moment that ended the last major independent Maya kingdom. But even then, cultural and linguistic continuities persisted in everyday life across towns and countryside. The end of pre-Columbian sovereignty did not erase memory, practice, or the demographic presence of Maya peoples. Thousands of years of agricultural knowledge survived those ruptures. Techniques such as milpa polyculture, terracing, and wetland modification continued in various forms and informed resilient subsistence strategies across Mesoamerica. Contemporary research and community practice show that many Maya farmers still draw on traditional ecological knowledge even as they adapt to modern pressures. This living technical heritage is as much an echo of the past as are the stone monuments. Today, the Maya are not relics in museums, they are living peoples. Millions of speakers of Maya languages maintain kin networks, ritual calendars, and place-based identities across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and beyond. That continuity complicates any narrative of disappearance. Languages, crafts, agricultural systems, and community histories link the present to the long sweep of Maya time. The rediscovery of cities by explorers and archaeologists and the accelerating revolution in LIDAR and epigraphy has deepened our understanding of what the Maya accomplished and how they adapted. But rediscovery also carries responsibility. Conservation,
ethical collaboration with descendant communities, and support for indigenous stewardship are essential if these ruins are to teach rather than simply astonish. The past is instructive only when it serves present people and future generations. In the end, the lesson is pragmatic and humane. Civilizations can be brilliant and vulnerable at once. Their complexity enables cultural heights, but also concentrates risk when environment or politics turn. The Maya case reminds us that resilience often rests in local knowledge, social networks, and adaptive institutions, and that human communities remake themselves in the face of challenge. If this series has sparked your curiosity, consider this next step. Learn one Maya word, read a descendant community's perspective, or support a local conservation or cultural preservation project. History is richer when the voices of those who live it are heard. Subscribe for the full documentary and tell us in the comments which Maya site or theme you want us to explore in depth, from water management to royal inscriptions to modern practices of the milpa.